Okay, we are recording. Good afternoon to our listeners. Uh, this, excuse me. Good afternoon. Today's webinar on what does this season's corn silage look like will be presented by Neal Wininger. He's the feed and forage consultant with Dairyland Labs in Wisconsin, and he'll be discussing what the lab analysis from this year's corn silage and foragers are telling him about the quality of the crop. Neal, we appreciate you taking the time to visit with us. The podium is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Fred. And we certainly appreciate the opportunity to present here today. As Fred mentioned, we're going to be discussing forage quality, kind of more so focused on corn silage, but I'm certainly going to delve into alfalfa haylage and some mixed haylage data that we have through the lab as well. So yeah, just focusing on what this year's crop looks like versus some historical data. So with that, I'll just go ahead and move along here to our agenda. I guess I kind of already mentioned the agenda here, kind of geared towards the corn silage, looking at the 21 crop versus 3-year historical data. And then I'll touch lightly on some alfalfa data, looking at what the quality is doing there, and then also looking at some alfalfa grass mixed haylage data as well. So moving along here to the next slide. Here's a slide that I've borrowed from Dr. Bill Weiss. I think it's a nice slide that kind of demonstrates the partitioning of where your energy is really coming from in your typical corn silages. Obviously corn silage isn't a very high protein forage, but the big thing is the NDF and the starch are the two biggest components to corn silage, and that's where a lot of your variation comes from. But that's where a lot of your energy or your potential energy is coming from. 42% of it on average coming from your starch fraction, and then another 31% is coming from your NDF fraction. And certainly a lot of variation within those fractions, both for the total NDF or total starch, but also the digestibility of those. But just wanted to make the point that, the biggest part of the energy in corn silage is coming from starch and NDF. So I just like sharing that slide right away. So delving into what we're seeing through the lab so far on the 2021 crop versus the 3-year data. First off, moisture contents, in general, pretty similar, just a tick higher on the average moisture content on this year's crop versus the historical data. Crude protein, as I already kind of touched on a little bit there, crude protein isn't a huge fraction when it comes to corn silage. Obviously it makes a difference, whether it's a little higher or a little lower, but so in general there, we're just seeing a slight tick up on the crude proteins versus previous data. NDF, neutral detergent fiber, as I already mentioned, kind of NDF is a big factor in corn silages, of course, and then hence the digestibility of those. But in general, this year's NDF values versus the historical data, there again, not much difference in total NDF contents. But then when we move on to the NDF digestibility at 30 hours, we do see a slight tick upwards in the NDF digestibilities versus the 3-year data. So, so we're seeing a little higher NDF digestibility, so that's a good thing. And then on the UNDF, of course, UNDF is the undigestible NDF, and this is at 240 hours of digestion. So kind of the endpoint, or what's never going to be digested. There we are actually stayed even versus previous data at 9.6% UNDF in those corn silages. Next on to starch. As I mentioned, I kind of touched on starch being a big factor in our corn silages from an energy standpoint on the average corn silage. And there again, our 3-year data is at 34.3% starch, and we're at 34.7. So it's pretty similar to the 3-year data. And moving along to total fatty acid content, there again, the fat content's pretty similar. And then lastly, the ash. So ash, obviously ash can be a negative in our energy to the cow, but also have other detrimental effects if we're bringing in ash from a soil contamination standpoint. So we have a slight decrease on the average ash contents in our corn silages coming through the lab thus far, which is a good thing. So yeah, I'll move along to the next slide here. So just comparing some of the 2021 samples coming out of Iowa in particular, and comparing those versus our complete data for the 21 crop so far. Comparing the same components again, moisture content very similar again at 65. Obviously there's some variation around those, which I'll kind of show you some distribution curves here in a minute. Protein, the Iowa samples are just a tick higher than all samples we're seeing. NDF, we're seeing a little bigger tick up in the Iowa samples versus all data, but really when it comes down to it, I mean, it's less than a point. In general, on the NDF digestibilities, the Iowa samples are coming in about a half point higher than all samples, and of course, versus the 3-year data, we're higher. And then on to the UNDF or undigestible NDF portion. They're again very similar to all samples through the lab. On to the starch. Here we're seeing the inverse. We're seeing a little lower starch value on the Iowa samples, but of course that's kind of runs inverse to what the NDF value does. So in general, if the NDF's higher, your starch contents are going to be a little bit lower. And that's not necessarily telling you that it's poorer silage, because we're making up for some of that with the NDFDs being higher on those silages in general. Down to the fatty acids, again, right on the same average value there. And then, but here's one thing we do see a little bit higher ash contents in the Iowa samples in general, just a little bit, another half point higher. So maybe on average, just a little bit more challenge, maybe with some of the chopping conditions, potentially with bringing in a little bit more potential soil contamination, raising those ash values, but not overly concerning, because if you looked at the data that I presented last year, these ash values are down, both all samples and the Iowa samples are down from the data we had presented last year. Next year, I broke out the BMR, or samples that are labeled as BMR variety corn silages coming through the laboratory. And looking at the 2021 data versus the 3-year data on the BMRs. Moisture contents on average just a tick higher than the previous 3 years. Protein right on the same. NDF or fiber content is virtually the same. But here, similar to all corn silage data that I just presented, the NDF digestibilities are 2 points higher. So we are seeing a significant tick up on the NDF digestibilities. And then inverse to that, of course, the UNDF 240 is down slightly at 0.4% less than the previous UNDF data. Moving along here to the starch, just a slight tick less starch. And then, like I say, the TFA and the total fatty acids and the ash contents very similar there again on the BMRs versus the historical data. I'll move along here and kind of show some people are more visual than looking at numbers. Here's the crude proteins, looking at distribution curves of the crude proteins on corn silages. The brown line would be our 3-year historical data versus the green line would be our distribution of the 2021 crop corn silages. And as you can see, 6 to 9% crude protein is going to cover most all of the samples, but of course the big majority is going to be falling in that 7 to 8, a little over 8, 7 to 8.25 is going to cover a fair majority of those corn silages. So you can see a slight slight slide to the right there with the crude protein being a little higher versus the 3-year data.
So Neal, bottom line is, so the starch is lower and the protein's a tad bit higher.
Yep.
Do you
bet.
credit that to improved genetics or a better year, or what's your thoughts?
I think it's hard to say. I do think I think part of it is as the years go by, in general, obviously, whether it's the farm, farms are looking harder and harder at putting up better and better silage, picking varieties, plant populations. There's a lot of things that go into, where you end up with for your ratio of starch to NDF, or whether you're looking at that ratio of the ear to stover. But certainly, I think there's a lot of pieces to that. Obviously, the weather can certainly affect that regionally. But I think some of that weather gets that kind of gets evened out when you look at all the data that comes through our lab, because certainly you're going to have regional differences, but we get samples from such a wide geographic area that it'll kind of negate some of that where you have localized differences in your silages. But yeah, I think in general, I'm sure part of it is farmers just in general doing a better job year after year, trying to put up better forage, but also probably better varieties and better management practices, et cetera, et cetera.
Did that protein slide include both the conventional and the BMR?
Yeah, that would have included all corn silages. Yep. And I think, back at the protein, I think there are certain years where we tend to see, obviously differences in some of the proteins. I do think part of the reasoning that the 3-year proteins are slightly less than this year's crop, I do think from even like last year's crop, I do think there was a significant area that maybe got excessive rain, where it maybe leached out some nitrogen, and you lost some nitrogen potential to make end up being protein in the plant. But certainly there's other factors in that, and I'm not an agronomist by any means, but that certainly can be part of the nitrogen factor playing into that crude protein. Any other questions or comments on the crude protein or other things I've kind of covered thus far? Otherwise, I'll kind of move along here to the NDF distributions that we see. Obviously, these are, the green line is pretty close to being right over the top of the brown line here. So not a huge change in your NDF. So, most of your NDF contents on these corn silage is going to be between 33 and about 45, as you can see there. Obviously there's kind of a slighter, longer leg to the right here with some of the real high fiber corn silages that didn't end up making much of an ear, but there's not a lot of samples out there, but there are some, obviously. Moving along to the NDFD distribution, as I mentioned, we did see a tick up on the NDFDs on average. So your green line again is your 2021 crop. As you can see, there's more samples here, and then off to the right, kind of signifying that we're seeing a little bit higher NDFDs on those corn silages again. The UNDF 240, there we didn't see much of a change. So there, that distribution curve is virtually right on top of one another there from the 3-year data to this year's data. Moving along to the starch contents, as I mentioned, there was a slight uptick in the starch contents. So you can kind of see that we had a few less samples here on the upper left part of that distribution curve, but then we added, there's some samples here on the backside with the higher starch contents. Is there any questions on kind of any of the starch numbers there? Like I see, most of the samples are going to be falling in between 25 and 45 as a whole, with that average being somewhere in that 35 range.
My only question would be like length of fermentation as compared to starch content and the relationship there. So these samples that come in this year compared to when they might have came in last year, how long they've been in fermentation.
Well, that's a little more of a challenge for us to judge, how long a given sample might be in fermentation. Certainly we can look at factors like, like the soluble protein, ammonia, fermentation acids, things like that. And you're wondering about the starch contents actually potentially changing as it ferments, or
Yeah,
are
I don't,
you?
I don't know if there's a relationship with it, but I know sometimes, just with the total availability of things, the longer the fermentation, the better we have the availability.
Right. Well, certainly the availability of the starch is more easily noted. We could certainly try to parse out, whether the actual total starch would change, but I think it'd be a little more difficult just because a lot of the samples aren't really labeled,
Right.
when
You
they,
wouldn't have the information to gather. Yeah.
right. But I think, like I say here, this slide, we're kind of delving into the starch digestibility piece of it. So this is looking at the in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours of digestion. And then here I'm breaking it off. I'm not looking at a whole year's worth of data. I'm just breaking off so we have a much larger percentage of samples being fresh. And, and I tried my best to try to parcel out, which ones are truly fermented versus, fresh or unfermenting or just beginning to ferment. But that gets to be a little bit challenging, and a lot of people submitting samples don't identify their sample if they're not obvious, whether they're old crop or new crop. But I think, just taking September to November data of 2020 versus September to November of 2021, and you compare the median in vitro 7-hour starch value versus this year versus last year, we are seeing, and this doesn't sound like much, going from 69.5 down to 67.9 on the median. But I do think it is significant when you get to look at the minimum values. On the low end, we are seeing almost a 6-point difference on the low end. So I've had reports from nutritionists kind of telling me some of these drier silages that might not be processed the best, or if they're maybe the kernels. I know there was a lot of reports of kernels getting mature while the plant was staying green. So there was a fair amount of that, but I think you see that here with the in vitro 7-hour numbers kind of showing us some of that information. Any question on the starch digestibility portion of it? Otherwise, here was kind of one of the points. I like this slide. This is our corn silage processing score data over time. We're going all the way back to 2010 and through current 2021 data. And kind of my point of this slide is, in conjunction with that 7-hour starch value, one of the downfalls of the 7-hour starch value is in the lab, we actually have to process the sample, meaning we have to grind it to a uniform particle size to then be able to analyze it. Whereas obviously processing score is going to give you a good estimate of that actual particle size of that starch or particle size of the kernels, and then give you another piece of, putting that puzzle together, feeding the cows. But anyways, the kind of the main points here of the processing score over the years, the green line would be your median processing score over the years. Obviously, in general, the industry has done a much better job getting corn processed in these silages. So that's why you kind of see that trend line up in general. But here, when you get into the new crop, we do see a small trend downwards. But here are black dots are representing individual samples. So you do see kind of a slug of lower end processing, which, some of those real mature or drier silages, tend to give you that kind of challenge there. Also, I do think we're through the laboratory, we run a fair amount of fecal starch analysis. And this is a distribution of fecal starches, you know, going from 0 to, well, we're way out to 20 here on the far end. You know, and obviously you want the fecal starches to be under 3 as a good goal for sure. And if not, you know, 1 or 2, we are seeing a slight uptick on these ones that are over 5% fecal starch. And so I'm sure some of that is probably contributed to some of those poorer processed corn silages that might be a little lower 7-hour starch digestibility values as well. So yeah, just keep that in mind, you know, whether you're a producer or nutritionist or that you know, might be worthwhile investigating if you are running into some challenges in feeding some of the silage from this year. I guess that was kind of my last slide on corn silage. With that, is there any questions or comments or on corn silage? Hearing none, I guess I'll go ahead and move along here to the alfalfa haylage data. Here we're again comparing the 2021 crop versus the 3-year historical data and looking at differences between those. Obviously the moisture content's very similar. Protein, just a small tick downwards, but we're still 21%. Your average NDF contents, just a slight tick up from 36.5 to 36.6. About a half point increase in the NDFD though. So that's a good, I mean, it's not a huge difference, but obviously if you have a little more NDF, it's good that the NDFD is up slightly with it as well. Your UNDF, right on about the same. Your ash contents, just a slight downtick on the ash content. And then your calculated RFV and RFQ. There again, the RFE ends up at a very similar 151 value on our average alfalfa haylage through the lab, but our RFQ is a slightly increased to a 160 versus a 158, and that's because of that NDFD increase there. And one thing I noticed, I know we talked about milk per ton prior to this, and I just realized that I did not include milk per ton on these slides, so I certainly apologize for that. But with that, I did write down some data here while we were talking before the meeting started. You know, obviously, if the RFQ is higher, your milk per ton is going to be slightly higher as well. So the data that I presented last year, the average milk per ton was 29.55 on it, and so you'd be slightly higher than that on the 2021 data. And I can certainly update these slides and share it with y'all later to adding that milk per ton value. So I certainly apologize for not including that on the slide set here. Then I kind of broke out the Iowa specific alfalfa haylages and then compared it to all data that we're seeing on 2021 crop. You know, as you can see, the moisture content very similar, protein again right on. The NDFs are slightly lower, about a half point lower on the Iowa samples, which is good. NDFD very similar. UNDF slight tick down, which is good. There is a slight uptick in the ash. And then you get down to your relative feed value and relative forage quality, slight tick up on the RFV, and then a little bit larger tick up on the RFQ. Of course, that's because of the, you know, the NDFD and NDF combination there. So next, I'm going to just kind of go through the distributions there again on looking at the 3-year data would be your brown line again, with the green line being the 2021 data. And like as I mentioned, there's just a slight tick down on the proteins, which you see just a few less samples way out here at the 25, 26 protein range. And you're seeing a few more samples up here that are in that 19 to 22 range. But in general, those distributions are following historical data rather well. Your NDF contents, they're just a slight tick up again, a few less samples here in the 31 to 33% NDF and a few more that are falling in that 36 to 39 range there. As I mentioned already, the NDFDs, we did see a slight uptick. So you're seeing a few less samples over here in the 35 to 40, 45 range. And then of course, a few more samples coming in at the higher ranges of 50 and above there, which was a good trend. UNDF, they virtually fell on the same value. Obviously, there's a few less samples here on that peak, but of course, then we have a few less here, and then a few more here. But in general, those distributions are falling pretty similar to the historical data there. Kind of following up on the ash contents here, we did see a slight tick downwards, a few less of these higher end ash values, and then we added a few more on the mid range there of 11 to 12, right up in there. So, you know, obviously most of your samples on alfalfa are falling in that 9 to 14 as a whole, but we saw a few less here in the 14 and saw a few more in that 11 area, which is good. Any questions on just your alfalfa haylage data in general? Otherwise, I'll kind of move along here to the alfalfa mix area. So moving along here, I think we did see a few bigger differences here when we go to the alfalfa grass and grass mix category. I think there's a number of reasons for that, which I'll kind of cover here when I go through the data. You know, in general, you look down this list, I mean, in general, you know, depending on opinion, really the values don't change a lot, but I think they're more subtle. But I think the subtle differences are because this grass mix, legume grass mix category, I think we're seeing a little more trend up on the average amount of grass, and some of these mixes are getting to be more popular, like we talked earlier with some of the cocktail type mixes, etc. So we're seeing, you know, a more significant drop in the crude protein here. In my mind, that's not huge, but you're seeing a 0.7 drop or decline in the protein, a slight uptick in the NDF. But so here your NDFD though, this is why I feel like this is more, it's getting more influence from the grass and maybe a larger percentage of grass in some of these mixes, because we're increasing digestibility. Yes, we did increase a little bit of fiber and we decreased a little bit of protein, but I think this number kind of outweighs that. We're seeing a downtick in the UNDF 240. Another thing is this ash content is lower, which ash is coming from, you know, natural minerals within the plant. So grass versus legume, you're going to tend to have a little higher ash content naturally within the plant from a mineral content standpoint, which is why I think we're seeing this slight decrease in the ash as well. But when you get down to the RFV and RFQ values, you know, pretty similar RFV 2021 versus the 3-year data, but this uptick in the RFQ because of this NDFD, even though the NDF went up, the NDFD went up more significantly to raise that RFQ value. Moving along to compare the Iowa specific samples to all of our 2021 data. Moisture very similar. Here again, I think from the Iowa, the data we're seeing from the Iowa samples, and we saw this last year when I presented, I do think from the Iowa data, for whatever reason, I think some of these mixes are more heavily weighted, almost inverse to what our entire database did. I think these are still a little more heavily weighted towards the alfalfa and legume side. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but I think that's just explaining the differences in the Iowa data versus our entire database data. So you see the increase in protein with that increase in legumes versus our total data there. The NDF being about a point lower. The NDFD is lower by about a point, but this NDFD value is higher than the data I presented last year on the Iowa specific samples, so that's good. Just a slight uptick in the UNDF, a slight uptick in the ash content, and then hence in the calculated RFV and RFQ, we did see an uptick in the RFVs. and then the RFQ about right on versus the historical data or the all lab data there. Any
So
questions or comments there? Go ahead, Fred.
when we look at this alfalfa grass mix haylage, that also includes some of these cocktails with non-traditional legumes in it.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the cocktail, and it really depends on what's in the cocktail mix, whether they get put in as a grass legume mix or whether they get put in. Some of those, some of those cocktails are coming in with a very high percentage of sorghum Sudan grass, where those in general would fall into a different category in our system. So they wouldn't fall under the mixed grass or mixed legume grass category. But some of the cocktails that are more so the, say ryegrass, clover, and if those are the biggest percentages of that given sample, they would fall into this category. Because like I say, you can see a pretty different way it analyzes whether it's a really high percentage of ryegrass and legume versus some of the ones that are very high sorghum Sudan grass. And I'm not trying to, downplay the sorghum Sudan grass. That can be great feed as well. But just for the fact on the lab side, comparing, number one, the calibrations to analyze those given samples underneath. That's where those, the ryegrass legume mix would fall better under this category that I'm presenting, where we have more data under that category as well.
So the sorghum mixes, do they, where do you put them when they come in? How do we identify what they're doing?
Well, if they are very high sorghum Sudan grass, they would go under the sorghum Sudan grass equations. But some of those, I'm sure some of this data does include samples that have sorghum Sudan grass, but it's just that it's probably a higher percentage of, the ryegrass and clovers and such. Because some of the earlier cuttings and then the very late cuttings on some of those too, you tend to have more of the ryegrass coming along versus the sorghum Sudan grass, where the mid-season cuttings, when it's hotter out, seems like it's higher percentage of the sorghum Sudan grass.
Okay.
So you bet. All right, any other questions there? Otherwise, I'll kind of go through the distributions quick here. Crude protein, as I mentioned, our entire database, the 2021 again is the green distribution and the brown is the 3-year data. As I kind of mentioned, it does seem the trend is to see a little more grasses or heavier on the grass mix, which is why I'm attributing to the protein being down a little bit, but not hugely significant in my mind. The NDF, we kind of saw the inverse trend, just a touch higher on the NDFs in general in this category. As you can see, there's, a few more samples in that 40 to 50 realm here versus less samples here on the backside. But, here's where I kind of pointed out, here's our big gain on the NDFD here in this category. A nice slide to the right with our trend line in the NDFDs in our alfalfa mixed grass category. And like I say, I attribute it mostly to that higher percentage of grass in those mixtures in general, attributing to most of that increase. Vice versa, the UNDF or the undigestible NDF at 240 hours, we saw the inverse trend, which you typically would, especially on the grass realm. So a little lower UNDFs there in general. And then I kind of touched on this already too, the ash, we saw a slighter lower trend on the ashes where we have more samples contributing here in that 8 to 10 range and less samples on the right side of the graph here in that 12 to 14 area. And I guess that's all I had for slides. I know I probably kind of went through that quickly. So if you have any questions or wanted me to kind of touch on any of the individual slides, we can certainly go through that. Or
As we see, and this is a personal question, as we see more of these leverage cocktails mixes out there, will you start, as you process them, start saying, okay, here's a cocktail mix with turnips, and here's one with whatever, will we see it break down even more than what we're seeing now?
you mean as far as kind of separating them more? Is
Yep.
that kind of what?
Yep.
Yeah, it really depends on volume. I guess volume and demand on samples. Certainly, this, quite honestly, it does add a challenge from a lab standpoint to keep on top of adding samples to calibrations to, and I feel like, the majority of the quote unquote cocktail mixes, I believe we've looked at a lot of NIR versus chemistry data to make sure that the NIRs are predicting very well. And I do feel like we've attained that, but like you mentioned, I mean, there is certain, it does seem like every year you hear about more unique cocktail mixes, and certainly that's where it helps from a lab standpoint when someone submits a sample to the lab to give us as much description of that sample as possible to make sure that we can then make sure that we can follow through on quality control and make sure that it's meeting specs and then meeting the right calibrations and everything else. And then that might give us a reasoning to do more wet chemistry on a more unique type of a mix when it does come to the laboratory.
Okay. I'll throw it open. Are there any other questions out there? I'm not seeing any mutes come off. Neal, thank you very much for your time on this webinar. We appreciate the information. And if people who are listening now or at a later date, if they look at the chat, they'll see that I've included the archive area there on our Iowa State Dairy Team website, as well as we would appreciate anybody who views this then to go and take our evaluations so we can glean information as far as how we can make a better webinar program. Again, Neal, thank you very much for your time and the information that you shared.
Well, thanks so much for having me. We certainly appreciate the opportunity. And if anybody ever has any questions, they can certainly reach out to me. Got my email address here, or even calling Dairyland Labs and asking us your question. So certainly welcome questions, and I love talking about forage. So thank you.
Very good. We thank people for attending, and we will go ahead and sign off.